It's time for my May reading wrap up. How many books did I read this month? Let's find out. Hello, book friends. I'm Jen, and welcome to my reading life. Today, I am here with my May reading wrap up. And while it was still a good reading month for me, I didn't read nearly as much as I have read the past couple of months. So if any of you were wondering how I read upwards of 20 books a month, I don't normally. March and April were a bit of an anomaly in my reading life, and I think this month is much more indicative of what my normal reading months are like. So let's just dive into the books, shall we? Like I said, I had a pretty good reading month. I read some really lovely books, and then I also had a few that I did not like. Just a few stats for you. I read 14 books, but 3 of those were DNFs. So I finished 11 books, DNF'd 3 books. I read, I think, mostly fiction this month. I don't think I read any nonfiction. And I think this month what I'm going to do, in the past I've been just going through chronologically in the order that I read the books, but I think this month I'm going to read them in order of enjoyment. So I'm going to start with the books I enjoyed the least, and then I'm going to work my way up to my favorite books of the month. So let's start with the 3 books that I DNF'd this month. And the first book that I DNF'd was actually one that I was buddy reading with 2 of my friends, Elizabeth and Susan, from over on Bookstagram. And I was really sad to DNF this one, but it just was not working for me. And that was The Fountain Overflows by Rebecca West. And this sounds really good. It's about a family. They're fairly musical, and this is set in, I think it's in London, I believe. And there are 2 twin sisters. One of the twins is narrating the novel, and then they have another older sister, Cordelia, and then their parents. Their father is maybe not so great at taking care of his family, and the mother lives a bit in this world where she was quite an accomplished pianist, and I think she's never quite gotten over the fact that she didn't sort of make a huge success of herself, and she's certainly trying to have her daughters follow in her footsteps. And this all sounds like it is a wonderful premise for a novel, but I found none of the characters to be particularly likable, and I really didn't like our narrator, and I was just really, I didn't want to pick the book up, and I had no impetus to keep going with it. I think I made it about 50 or 60 pages, and I was like, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth and Susan, but I just can't go on with it. It's not that she's a bad writer, it's just that this did not work for me. Then the next book that did not work for me was off of my TBR 24 and 24. In fact, the next 2 DNFs were both off of my TBR 24 and 24. That's just how it goes sometimes. The first one was Mothering Sunday by Graham Swift. And again, the premise of this sounds interesting. It's a spring day in 1924, and there is a 22-year-old maid, Jane Fairchild, at an English country house. She's having an affair with the young heir of the neighboring estate, and you are sort of seeing them on Mothering Sunday, which I didn't realize, but in England, Mothering Sunday, which is Mother's Day here in the US, used to be a day when servants would get the day off to go see their mothers, or if their mothers had passed, to go visit their mothers' graves, just to spend the day sort of honoring their mothers. It was one of the few days that they actually got off from work. And then the families that live in these country estates have gone off to lunch because there's no servants to do anything for them. So clearly they can't fend for themselves. They have to go off and have someone else cook for them. So nobody is around. So the young man and this maid meet up, and the book's quite explicit, which I don't mind. I don't need to have a completely closed door romance, but it felt a little gratuitously graphic about some things, which I didn't think was necessary, especially for what was, attempting to be a very literary book. And I walked away from this feeling like Graham Swift does not understand women. And he certainly doesn't understand what a 22-year-old maid in 1924 England would have been thinking or how she would have been acting. I didn't buy it. I didn't buy her inner monologue, which we get a lot of. And I found this just completely unbelievable. I had high hopes for this one. And again, another disappointment. So that was too bad. And then my final DNF of the month. You guys, I'm really not doing well with stories about the ballet world right now, which is just breaks my heart because it is something I love to read books about the ballet world and about dancers and all of that. And I've read some really wonderful books about it, but recently, oof, it's not been good. And the next one that wasn't good was White Swan, Black Swan by Adrienne Sharp. Now, I will say this isn't terrible. This is a collection of short stories. And I think I read the first 3 short stories in here. Yeah, I got through the first 3. And then unfortunately, I had read another collection of short stories, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that I did enjoy. And I think maybe coming on the heels of that was not the best way to go into this book, because I just feel like these short stories didn't have the same sort of strength of writing behind them. It felt very much like, okay, so what was the point of that story? And therefore, I didn't particularly care about the characters in the story or what was happening. Not terrible, just there are many better short story collections out there. And I just decided I didn't want to read any further in this. That is it for the DNFs for this month. So let us dive into the books that I read. And I'm going to start with the books I liked the least and work my way up to the books I liked the best. None of these books were terrible by any means. So let me just state that right there. So the first book I want to talk about is Wild Strawberries by Angela. Is it Thirkell or is it Thirkell? I don't know. I've always said Thirkell, but I've listened to a number of booktubers and they say Thirkell, so I feel like I'm wrong. I should probably Google that and see. Anyway, by Angela Thirkell or Thirkell, whichever it is. And this is the second book in her Barsetshire Chronicles series. I read High Rising last year, and I also read Christmas at High Rising. And in Wild Strawberries, we follow a different family. They live at the estate of Rushwater. And we follow Mary Preston, and she is a guest of her Aunt Agnes, who is the daughter of Lady Emily and her husband, who own Rushwater. And the family is there, and it's just all about Mary and the family and sort of their eccentricities. And it's just a little bit of slice of life, I think, as Angela Thirkell's novels are. At least in this series. And as much as I loved High Rising, I think Wild Strawberries was good. I enjoyed it, but it didn't grab me in quite the same way as High Rising did. There's a little bit of a love triangle in here, and that was kind of fun. Even though it was very clear from very early on exactly what was going to happen in the end, it was kind of fun to go along for the ride of that. Again, this was good. I definitely want to continue reading the Barsetshire series, but this one probably won't go down as one of my favorites. If you're reading this series, let me know which of the books you really enjoyed, because that way I can keep my eye out for those. If anyone has any further insight into this series, let me know. I would love to know if I can just kind of skip around and read the ones I want to read. So, but good, but not great. But read High Rising, because that one's fantastic. And then next up is the third book from my TBR 24 in 24 stack that I read this month. And that was Arranged Marriage by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. And this is a collection of short stories. And this was the book that made Black Swan, White Swan not live up to my expectations of it, because this is an excellent collection of short stories. I think Diva Karuni is a fantastic short story writer. I will say that all of the stories in here have a level of darkness and a bit of heaviness to their themes. A lot of it is about women and their sort of inability to move beyond their circumstances. Obviously, it talks a lot about arranged marriages and sort of how women find themselves in predicaments and in marriages where it's not happy. It's could be maybe violent or abusive or just a really bad situation for some reason. I just think she's such a good writer, and this is the second or third book of hers that I've read, and I definitely want to read more. But you definitely need to be kind of in the right frame of mind to read her stories, because they're definitely not light and frothy, but really well written. I really enjoyed this. And obviously I enjoyed some of the stories more than others in this collection. There's one about a woman who takes in a young boy, and I really love that story. That's probably the one that's going to stick with me the most out of all of these. Heartbreaking, but ultimately I think this is a really wonderful collection. Then next is my pick for Read Christie 2024 for May, and I decided to read Cards on the Table. And I mentioned, I believe, when I put this in my May TBR, that I have a special connection to this book because I was in the stage version of this book many years ago now, and I played Rhoda Dawes, who is one of the characters in this book. And the stage play is slightly different from the book. Hercule Poirot does not feature in the stage play, but he is in the book. We do have Ariadne Oliver. She is in the stage play and she is in this. One of Christie's recurring detectives is also in this. It's sort of like all the detectives get together and they try to solve this one. It takes place at Mr. Shaitana's house, and he invites Poirot to a party to view Shaitana's private collection. And his private collection is that of maybe some people who have committed murders. And then they play a game of bridge, but it turns a little bit deadly. And then we need to solve what happens and sort of figure out who done it, but also, you know, did these people actually commit other murders in their lives as well? So there's kind of like a couple of different mysteries going on here. And it was really fun. It was fun for me to see the differences between the book and the stage play, and to kind of refresh my memory of it. And I really enjoyed this one. I think this is an underrated Christie novel. I think the mystery in this is really good. I will say that following sort of the bridge sequences in here is a little bit challenging if you don't know bridge, but it doesn't take away from your enjoyment of the book. And I thought this was just really good fun. So I definitely recommend if you haven't read Cards on the Table. Then next up, I have another mystery, and this has been sitting on my shelf for far too long, and that is Exiles by Jane Harper. And I received an advanced reader copy of this, and I don't know why I didn't read it when I first got it. I love Jane Harper. I've read everything that she has written now that I've finished this one, and she is a fantastic Australian author of mysteries. And this one, we're back with Aaron Falk. Not all of her mysteries feature him, but she definitely has a series starting with The Dry. And in this one, at a festival, a baby is found alone in her stroller and the mother has vanished. And a year later, that absence casts a long shadow, and her friends and loved ones are kind of gathering back together. This festival is happening again, and Aaron is there, and he sort of begins to suspect that there's something going on in this tight-knit group of friends. And so he starts to pretty much investigate, mostly because the daughter of the woman is so sure that something terrible has happened, and she's kind of doing her own investigating, and Falk kind of gets involved in sort of helping her. And I listened to this on audio actually, which was really wonderful. I enjoyed the narrator of this, and I really like listening to mysteries on audio. I just find because of the pacing and because they're very plot driven that it's easy for me to stay engaged with them. And I really liked this. This is another excellent mystery by Jane Harper, and I'm looking forward to whenever her next book comes out, which I will hopefully read sooner than it took me to read The Exiles. Next up is a book I read for my book club this month, and that is Something Fresh by P.G. Wodehouse. And this is the first book in the Blandings Castle series by Wodehouse. And I have a collection. This is Life at Blandings, and it has Something Fresh, Summer Lightning, and Heavy Weather in it. And I only read Something Fresh this month, so I will need to get to the other two. But in this, it's basically there is a house party going on at Blandings Castle. And when this book starts, the first few chapters, I was kind of like, what is going on here? How are these characters all going to be interconnected? And then Wodehouse does a really good job of weaving their stories all together. There is a missing scarab that is kind of central to this, so there's a bit of a mystery going on, and two of the characters are kind of pitted against each other to try to, they know where the scarab is. They think it's been stolen, but there's sort of a funny story behind that. Anyway, and they're going to try and get it back while at this house party. And yes, so numerous hijinks ensue, and there is a very, very funny scene that happens when they do try to get the scarab back, and it's just hilarious. I was laughing out loud. I think Wodehouse is so, so funny, and I'm so glad that I read this. My book club, we really loved this one, and I'll definitely be reading more in the Blandings Castle series because this one was definitely a winner for me. Very, very fun. I highly recommend it. Then my next book, oh gosh, 3 mysteries in a row. Next up is Strong Poison by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is the next book in the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery series. I think this is book 6 because book 5 is a collection of short stories. And in Strong Poison, we finally meet Harriet Vane, and she is basically on trial for murdering her fiance. And Lord Peter Wimsey is convinced that she didn't do it, even though all the evidence is pointing towards her. And he does his very best to try to prove her innocence. And I absolutely loved this book. My favorite in the series so far. I said it a million times, and I will say it once more, that this series just gets better and better as it goes along. And I am super, super excited to read the next book in June. But yes, I think Harriet Vane really adds a lovely dimension to the books. And even though she doesn't feature prominently in Strong Poison, I mean, she's definitely, you don't see her a ton, but just the banter between her and Wimsey and just her mere presence really elevates this. And I really feel like Dorothy L. Sayers kind of settles in this one, and I really found the mystery to be one that I was engrossed in, and just kept me turning the pages, which is the best thing I can say for a mystery novel. It makes me want to find out who done it, who really done it. And then next up is a book I read very, very early in the month, and that is Darling by India Knight. And Darling is a retelling of The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, set in the modern day. And this book, I loved this book. It was so, so good, so witty, so funny, such a good take on the original. And I couldn't get enough of it. I loved, it follows the story pretty much verbatim, only with sort of the additional elements of modern day life, like cell phones and social media and all of these different things. And it just made this so funny. I loved Uncle Matthew. He was a character in Pursuit of Love that I really didn't like very much, but in Darling, I adored him. He was hilarious. He's basically an aging rock star. Like, he was in a heavy metal band from the 1980s, made tons and tons and tons of money, so now he's very rich. But he's sort of retired to the country where he wants to like keep his family away from the trials and tribulations of fame. And so he doesn't let them have cell phones. They don't have the internet. They don't have any of this stuff at their house. And there is this section, it is pages and pages talking about all the things that Uncle Matthew hates. And I was just crying tears of laughter. It was so very funny. I cannot recommend this enough. If you enjoyed The Pursuit of Love, definitely read this. I think it can stand on its own, even if you haven't read The Pursuit of Love, but I think if you read that one first, you'll get so much more out of this book, and it is absolutely fantastic. All the praise for it is definitely worth it. Loved, 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 loved. The next book was another book that I listened to on audio, and I am so glad that I did because I think the audio was such a lovely experience, and that was On the Banks of Plum Creek by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I am so enjoying reading through the Little House on the Prairie books. This is such a fun little thing I just decided to do on a whim this year, and I am thoroughly, thoroughly enjoying it. I think this is my favorite in the series so far. In this one, I feel like the trials and tribulations of prairie life really come to a head and add definitely a level of drama that I wasn't expecting in this one. And listening to it on audio, I did not want to stop listening. It was so riveting what was happening, and I love how we get to hear Pa's fiddling when you listen to the audiobook, so that just kind of adds another dynamic to the experience of listening to this one. And I just love this. I love that the girls are getting a little bit older, and they are going to school, and that's a new experience for them. And it is amazing what they went through. Speaking for my own personal modern day self, there's no way I would have survived. I would have died on the prairie. My hat is off to the Ingalls family for basically just surviving in a place that I definitely would not. So this is really wonderful, and I will be reading the next book in the series, I think in July, kind of doing every other month reading one of these, and it's just really been lovely. Next up is the only book that I reread in May, and this was 5 stars the first time I read it. It's 5 stars this time that I've read it, and that is Shine On, Bright and Dangerous Object by Laurie Colwin. Again, I adore Laurie Colwin, and I love all of her books, and I can't sing her praises enough. In this one, we follow Elizabeth. She goes by Ollie, and she's become a widow at the age of 27. And this is just about her figuring out where her life goes from there and kind of reconciling who she is now that she is no longer the wife of her husband, Sam. And she develops a friendship with Sam's older brother as they are kind of grieving together. And, it's just sort of about what happens to her. And I just feel like Laurie Colwin, she's so insightful about human nature, about relationships, about women's lives. And I could just read her every day of the week. I think she's just absolutely fantastic. And it's been so, so long since I read this one, and I'm really glad that I reread it in May. And I definitely recommend this one. Really good. And then the final 2 books that I read in May were my very, very favorites of the month. One I read very early in the month, and one I read at the tail end of the month. So I got to bookend my month with 2 really wonderful books. And the first one is Volume 5 in the Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon. And I should say who this is by, by Beth Brower. And this series, I adore this series. It is quirky and original, and it's so lovely. I love epistolary novels, and this is written as a series of journal entries by our lovely Emma. And this is set in 1883 in London. And I'm not going to give you any details about this book because you really need to read them all in order. Suffice it to say, St. Crispian's, which is the neighborhood that Emma lives in, is very unique. And there's some kind of interesting, almost supernatural like things that happen in St. Crispian's. And it's a really fun to kind of go along. They add kind of a layer of a little bit of mystery to these, and there's some romance, and there's a bit of slice of life, and Emma is kind of, I would say she's coming of age, but more she's coming into her own really, and figuring out her life and what she wants to do with it and what she wants to make of it. And she loves to read. And that is just another wonderful element of these books. And at the end of each book, there's a list of all the books Emma has in her library. Her library, she had no books to begin with, really. And she's slowly gaining more and more books. And it's really fun to like read through the collection of what she now currently owns at the end of each of these novels. So I love anything that has like a list in it. I love lists. And that just kind of adds to these books for me. And again, I cannot recommend these enough. If you just want a really fun story that will sweep you away and you will read it in just a few hours, Emma M. Lyon is for you. I think it would make a wonderful series to read over the summer. And then my final book for May, and my very, very favorite read of the month by far, was The Amazing Mrs. Polifax by Dorothy Gilman. I buddy read this with the lovely Miriam at Miriam Elizabeth Reads, and we both adored this book. This is the second book in the Mrs. Polifax mystery series. And if you don't know, Mrs. Polifax is a 60-something-year-old woman. She's raised her family, she has grandchildren, and she's just kind of, you know, living her life, going to her garden club and playing bridge and doing all those things that 60-year-old women are expected to do. And suddenly she decides she is going to walk into the CIA and offer up her services. And so she does that in the first book. And amazingly enough, they take her on and they make her a courier. And she goes on a series of adventures in the first book. And then in this one, she is called upon to play her courier role again. And she finds herself in Turkey. And things maybe don't go exactly to plan. But Mrs. Polifax just manages to take it all in stride, and she figures her way out of things, and she meets some really wonderful characters in this one. She meets the young Colin, and he is such a fun young man. Really loved him. And then she and Colin team up with Sandor, and he seems to be maybe a bit nefarious, but has a certain code of ethics that he lives by, and he ends up kind of helping them out, and he's another wonderful character. And yes, there may be some like, wow, that was quite a coincidence that that happened, but Mrs. Polifax is such a fun character. I just love her so much. I mean, when I grow up, can I be Mrs. Polifax too? I realize she's supposed to be maybe like, 12 to 16 years older than I am, but that's who I want to be when I grow up. And I'm loving this series. I have the next 4 or 5 books, and I am planning to do a whole Mrs. Polifax binge this summer because I am just loving these right now. And this one was so, so good. I can't believe I have never read these before. It's exactly the kind of mystery series that I love. So I highly, highly recommend these, but definitely I think you need to read them in order to fully enjoy the series. And both Miriam and I are hopeful that maybe some of the characters from this book will show up in later books. So we'll see if that happens. That was my entire May reading month. It was, like I said, a pretty good one aside from the 3 DNFs that I had. But like I said, I read fully 11 books and I DNF'd 3 for a total of 14 books this month. And I would say that's probably pretty average for me. I hope you enjoyed my May reading wrap up. I'd love to know, have you read any of these books? And also, what did you read in May? Did you read something that you particularly loved? I would love to hear that. Did you DNF anything as well? I mean, sometimes you just have to DNF. Are you a DNFer? I mean, not everybody is. I used to not be. I used to feel like I needed to power through. But I've just come to realize that not every book is for me. And that's okay, because I can then put that book back out in the world and maybe just the right person will pick it up and it will be just the right book for them. As always, if you could give this video a like and hit that subscribe button, I really, really appreciate it. I'm so glad that you are all here, and I will be back with another video very soon. Bye.